Welcome along to this video where I'm joined by John Stewart of the RLA. And John, it's interesting because both at Property Tribes and on the RLA helplines, we've both noticed an increase in the problem of tenant hoarders. And I thought it'd be a good idea to perhaps talk a little bit about this issue and how landlords can deal with it. But I guess to start, prevention is always better than cure. And this is another reason for landlords to undertake mid-term property inspections, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and property inspections really are key. They can nip no end of problems in the bud, but hoarding is potentially one of those issues. It can be maybe a little bit difficult to spot because it's something that will generally start quietly and build up over time. But I think if landlords are carrying out inspections, if they can get access to the property and just keep an eye out for multiples of the same item, perhaps things you wouldn't maybe normally expect to see in a room, signs if there is a spare room within the property or loft space, just stick your head up there and just check what's being kept up there. Is it a few boxes that are left over from moving in, or is it a few hundred boxes with all the junk they've bought at a car boot sale or whatever. Property inspections can be key to nipping problems like this in the bud.
And you mentioned getting access to a property. Actually, it seems to me that if a tenant is consistently refusing access to a property for a gas safety certificate, for instance, that can also perhaps be a red flag that all is not well.
Yeah, if a tenant is treating the property well, if the property is being used properly, if you like, we're not expecting immaculate properties, places are being lived in, but if a tenant is just living in a property, using it as their home, there should be no reason to refuse a landlord entry. So if a tenant is consistently putting you off inspecting the property, if they are outright refusing you entry, that really should set the alarm bells ringing. And it should set the alarm bells ringing for no end of reasons. It's not just about things like hoarding, but potentially we had a property in North Wales where a member discovered a cannabis farm after a tip-off from a neighbour after she'd been refused entry for a routine inspection. So there's all sorts of problems that might arise if you can't get in to do what is a reasonable request to come and just check that all's well with the property. It's an opportunity for you as well to tell the tenant that to pick up on things that the tenant might not pick up on. So it's a two-way thing. It's not just about you making sure your property is being looked after. It's actually a chance for the tenant to raise something with you face to face, to make requests, or for you to spot something in the property that perhaps the tenant hasn't that you can get sorted.
And now let's move on to a landlord that actually discovers a hoarder tenant, and this can take many forms. It could be, rooms full of rubbish and detritus. It could be newspapers. It could be perishable goods that are going off and causing smells, etc. It's very hard to know how to deal with it, and my feeling is initially a soft touch approach in the respect of, do you have next of kin or guarantor details? Involve the tenant support network in trying to help them solve the problem.
Yeah, I think that's quite important. Quite often hoarding can be a sign of other issues within an individual's life, most typically mental health issues. The other thing is that sometimes hoarders can be very protective of what they're hoarding as well. So, a direct approach may lead to an unhelpful response, for want of a better phrase. It could cause the tenant to clam up. It could cause them to perhaps to refuse entry in the future. So perhaps using a third party in the first instance, someone that the tenant knows and trusts, is a good way of initially trying to tackle that problem.
Indeed, and you also mentioned to me off camera actually neighbours as well. Neighbours can quite often be a good communication channel to the landlord that all is not well at the property. They may have a relationship with the tenant, they may be a conduit to the tenant. So I think again we're stressing how important these relationships and communication issues are.
Neighbours can be a landlord's best friend. I mean, if you have rental properties, and particularly if they're not local to you, do try and build up a rapport with neighbours, especially if they have lived there long term. They will very quickly get an idea of problems and issues locally and within your property potentially. So if you are renting property, do make a point of introducing yourself to the neighbours. Do let them know that the property is being rented. Give them your contact details to raise any issues, because you in some ways they are there 24/7, 365 days a year, and will pick up on things much more quickly than you will. So if you have a rapport, a relationship with the neighbours, if they know that there's an issue and they contact you, that issue will be dealt with. You can save yourself a lot of heartache.
So John, if we've tried to involve a support network to help the tenant, we've advised the tenant that they've got, say, 2 weeks to address the problem within the property, and those avenues fail, I don't think we want to say automatically reach for a Section 21 notice or maybe a Section 8, but because it could be a mental health problem. The tenant may need support from the local authority. So I guess the next stage is to perhaps go to environmental health and see if they can send in a team to clean the property.
It's certainly worth contacting the local authority in some shape or form. It may be that your tenant already has links with the local authority through other services. They may be aware if there is a mental health problem. They may already be receiving support from the social work service or social care. But certainly I would approach the local authority, let them know that there is an issue, ask them if they're are aware of the tenant. They obviously won't be able to share detail with you, but if a service is already dealing with the tenant, then again that's another avenue in to try and get the problem resolved amicably and a route to stopping the problem building up again. But it might be that if it is perishable goods or the like, then you do need to involve environmental health. If it's an issue that's beginning to impact on neighbours, be it through the appearance of the house or smell, leakage or anything like that, then you probably will need to involve environmental health to try and get that resolved. So that would be the first avenue, would be to approach the local authority. If there's not a support network there that you can approach, or that's been unsuccessful, then a slightly more formal approach would be to look at environmental health, possibly social care, to see if they're aware of the tenant and seek help that way.
Now, just really the ultimate stage, we've had comments on property tribes where the local authority has denied that they've got any involvement with it. The environmental health have said it's nothing to do with them. Social services have said it's nothing to do with them. So it's put back on the landlord. And again, my feeling is that most landlords wouldn't want to evict because the tenant may have issues. And we have evidence of hoarder tenants being very good payers, so it's not necessarily a rent arrears issue. But I guess the final thing a landlord could do is to agree with the tenant that the landlord will send in a specialist cleaning team. And he's going to have to pay for that. Yeah.
Again, that's something that a landlord might want to consider in the circumstance, perhaps where they are otherwise a good tenant and paying. A landlord might even wish to offer some financial support to get that cleaning done. But you're right. I think a landlord in those circumstances, if they can get the agreement of the tenant to come in and clear the mess or the hoarding of whatever objects are creating the problem, then the tenant could well be liable for that cost. The real issue is, of course, if as we alluded to earlier, it may either occur again or the tenant may simply refuse access. If there are mental health or emotional problems or an emotional attachment to the hoarded items, sometimes it may well be that it's simply not possible to get the agreement of the tenant. And in those circumstances, then unfortunately more formal action will need to be looked at.
So I think what we'd just like to say to conclude this video is that if you do have a hoarder tenant, please try the approaches that we've suggested first. I think that is the most ethical way to deal with this problem. And if anybody any landlords watching the video have had experience of hoarder tenants, we'd be very interested to know how you've resolved that problem. And if you could share that with the property community, I think it would really help, because I do believe, we are going to see an increase in this. I see a lot of items in the paper about it where people are living in rooms where they've stacked up newspapers and they're literally sleeping in the top 2 feet of the room.
Yeah, or there's a maze through the boxes to
yeah.
get from room to room. It's traditionally been more of an issue for social housing, and I think there's been a number of cases where social landlords have had to go to evict. And as the private rented sector becomes home to more and more vulnerable tenants, because local authorities rely more and more on private sector housing to meet their homeless obligations or their housing obligations, then it is a problem that will only increase within the private rented sector. So landlords need to be aware of it as a possibility, and need to be aware, if they do encounter hoarding, that there are a number of avenues to explore before looking at potentially having to evict the tenant.
And if you need further help with this and you are a member of the Residential Landlords Association, they can of course call the advice line as well for support, can't they?
Yeah, the RLA Landlord Advice Team is a fantastic resource. There won't be a problem out there, I think, that they haven't already dealt with in some shape or form. They dealt with over 40,000 calls last year, and within that there's the full range of issues that any landlord could really expect to come across, and hoarding is certainly one of those.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this video, John. I think it's really good to air this topic, and we look forward to hearing any of your feedback if you've experienced a hoarder tenant and how you dealt with it, and how supportive actually the local authority was in helping you find a solution for that tenant. And of course, we reiterate, be sure to get your next of kin details or a guarantor details. They are a line of communication if there's an issue with your tenant, and also to undertake mid-term property inspections so you can see if this problem has started to develop. Thank you for watching.